all of you who may be listening throughout this expanse called Earth. It is January 31st, 2022. The new WCEG Network welcomes you. This program is Issues and Answers, and I am your host, Norman A. Carter Jr. On your computer or smartphone, you can view us or hear us by typing WCEGtalkradio.com, or in your browser, hit enter. And on the next screen, click the live stream tab. On your smart TV, just click the YouTube icon and search for WCEG Network and look for this mug on Issues and Answers, and you'll find us. WCEG stands for Worldwide Community Empowerment Group. Our programming goal is to leave you more informed and more empowered than you were before you tuned in, especially this program. Our motto, we speak life into the community. You may like us on Facebook and view us live. Follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at WCEG_talk_radio and at WCEG Network. The topics and opinions of Issues and Answers are those of me, Norman A. Carter Jr., and my honored guest, and not the WCEG Network. So leave my boss alone. This is my show. These are my words and the words of my guest. Ladies and gentlemen, things here in Georgia have gotten serious because of incendiary comments by the former president of the United States. The Fulton County District Attorney has asked for a federal investigation and federal protection. We are in serious times, folks. It has become nationally known that during and after the presidential election of 2020, Georgia and 6 other states became the Republican Party's petri dish in an experiment in political terror, voter suppression, and voter nullification. From the Brennan Center for Justice, this quote: over the last 20 years, states have put barriers in front of the ballot box, imposing strict voter ID laws, cutting voting times, restricting registration, and purging voter rolls. These efforts, which received a boost when the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2013, have kept significant numbers of eligible voters from the polls. And that hits all Americans, but placing special burdens on racial minorities, poor people, and young and old voters. Now, this quote is from our former president of the United States on January 15, 2022. All of a sudden, things closed and reopened, and voila, look what happened, Trump said about Pennsylvania. So we have to be a lot sharper next time when it comes to counting the vote. There's a famous statement: sometimes the vote counter is more important than the candidate. And we can't let that ever happen again. We have to get tougher and smarter. End quote. This statement comes from the United States president, who called Georgia's Republican Secretary of State and asked him to find 1,189 votes in 2020. This was unprecedented, and this event is currently being considered for criminal prosecution by the Fulton County District Attorney, who is now feels that she's under threat by comments made by that former president. Now, the Supreme Court on June 24, 2013, effectively struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by a 5-4 vote, freeing 9 states, mostly in the South, to change their election laws without advance federal approval. Crazy. Since that time, the Make America Great Again movement has steadily worked to institute regressive legislation designed to both discourage voting and to make voting more difficult for minorities and people living in rural communities. Lincoln County, Georgia, is about to become one of the latest victims of this regressive tactic, as the rural county is about to close all but one of its polling locations. This will make it difficult for voters who have limited access to transportation to vote. This is not just a Georgia problem. Voting suppressors from across the country are watching and plotting their next move in both political terror and voter suppression. Florida's governor wants to establish a police department that focuses totally on voting. This is a regression to 1898 successful coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, where both the police department and armed vigilantes forced Black voters away from voting and threatened to murder anyone who challenged them. Read this book, Wilmington's Lie, by David Zucchino. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. History is repeating itself. Today, we have a candidate who has pledged to keep voter suppression from flourishing in Georgia. He is the candidate for Georgia's Secretary of State, Dr. John Eaves, a vote counter, potentially. Welcome, Dr. Eaves.
Brother Carter, well said with your intro. You really covered on a lot of important topics that I certainly am looking forward to comment on this evening.
Fantastic. Dr. Eaves, if you don't mind, I'd like to give our audience, the few who don't know you, a little bit of your background, if you don't mind.
Sure, by all means.
We'll save the question. We'll save your talking for questions later. Dr. Eaves was born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida. He attended and graduated from Morehouse College and was a walk-on player for the football team, where he became a four-year letterman and team captain by his senior year. For those of you who don't know anything about football, to be a walk-on and then become a letterman and team captain, that is amazing. While at Morehouse, he received local and national recognition for his volunteerism in the Atlanta public school system. He is the nephew of former Atlanta Police Commissioner Reginald Eaves, who was also an Atlanta mayoral candidate. And I got to say, I heard an inspirational speech from Mr. Eaves many, many years ago in Philadelphia. Fantastic gentleman, fantastic. After graduating from Morehouse, Dr. Eaves served as the national director of the NCAA Volunteer for Youth program and was the Southeast Regional Director of the Peace Corps. In 2006, he was elected as chairman of Fulton County, Georgia, which is Georgia's most populous county, where he served for 11 years. He has an established reputation as a staunch advocate for healthcare, transportation, voting registration and access, homelessness, and criminal justice reform. Yes. Dr. Eaves holds a master's degree in religion from Yale University and a PhD in educational administration from the University of South Carolina. He is the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including two Fulbright Awards, that's huge, from in Germany and Finland, and an American Memorial Fellow. He launched Atlanta Speaks on one of my favorite networks, the Atlanta Interfaith Broadcasters Network. I watch it frequently. This program addresses various community and political issues, such as criminal justice reform and the integrity of U.S. elections. Among its features guests has been current Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. Over the past 13 years, he has been the executive director of the Global Youth Ambassadors Program. This program has helped over 500 high school students from underserved communities with international travel and leadership travel experiences. Presently, Dr. Eaves is the senior instructor at Spelman College in Atlanta, where he teaches bright African-American women. He is the devoted father of 2 adult children and resides in Atlanta. Today, he is with us as candidate for Georgia's Secretary of State. I must say to my audience, this is not my first time interviewing Dr. Eaves, but it's the first time on this network. Dr. Eaves, welcome to
Thank you so much, Brother
WCEG.
Carter. I'm excited about being engaged with your listening audience. This is exciting.
We're glad to have you. Dr. Eaves, what do you perceive as the greatest challenges facing you as a candidate for Secretary of State and for the office of Secretary of State?
Well, thank you for this opportunity and the question. So I'm running for this very important position. You laid out a lot of the issues that are evolving around voting in the state of Georgia, but really across the United States of America. And this position is an executive position. It's one of the most powerful positions in the state of Georgia or any state. And with my success, I'll be the first African-American elected to this position in Georgia ever, probably the entire Southeast. And having said that, I think some of the challenges are, number one, sort of the geographical terrain in which I have to campaign. Georgia is a state of almost 11 million people, and it's not just Atlanta, but it's many parts in coastal Georgia, southern Georgia, southwest Georgia, middle Georgia. So I've had to travel, and there are 159 counties in Georgia, the second most number of counties in any state in the country, second only to Texas. And so the biggest challenge has been just getting around. And related to that challenge has been really educating the voter about the importance of this office and the importance of voting. So the challenges have been the geographical terrain, as well as just educating the voter about the office, how important it is, and how important it is to vote and have representation.
One thing I will go back to my past experience interviewing you, sir, is that your presentations tend to be both inspirational as well as educational. And we find that many candidates are more concerned about the inspirational rather than the educational. So how do you balance that?
Well, thank you for the compliment. You know, at the end of the day, I'm a teacher. So as you pointed out in the intro, I'm currently teaching at Spelman College. And yes, there's some dynamic women over there, and they keep me on my P's and Q's. You know, Barack Obama had sort of this knack, you know, he was sometimes, I guess, complimented and criticized as being professorial. Can't even pronounce it right. So we have a tendency to kind of explain, but I do have a tendency to try to exude passion, because I'm incredibly passionate about the political process and the position that I'm running. So there is a balance. There's a balance of, you certainly enjoy explaining and breaking it down on the elementary level so everybody can reasonably understand it, but I also want to inspire and motivate people to want to do something about what I share.
Here in Georgia, which has been previously been known as a blue state, a red state, which is sort of turning slightly. Do you think it's a difficult, well, you had expressed some concern about the geographical setup of Georgia, but getting into those communities that are somewhat remote, somewhat distant, especially from what we can call today maybe the Atlanta political atmosphere.
Yeah. So Georgia's a really unique state. As I mentioned, it's nearly 11 million people. And let me just share, I'm a numbers person. So I majored in mathematics when I was at Morehouse. I love numbers. And so Georgia is actually 49% non-white, according to the US Census report that came out in 2020, which is phenomenal. A southern state that almost has a majority minority population. The state is also 32% Black, which has one of the highest percentages of Black residents. Many of the residents who are people of color and people in general live in metropolitan Atlanta. So this is a 10-county region. So 60% of the people in Georgia live in the 10-county region, but 40% of the folks live outside of Georgia. And so as a candidate who really wants to reach all the people, you got to go out. And so I've gone to many of the rural areas in Georgia, the coastal part from Savannah down to Brunswick, the southern part from Brunswick across to Valdosta, and the middle part of Georgia around Macon. And not only are those areas, you do have cities like Savannah and Macon, Valdosta, but you also have rural communities like Waycross, Woodbine, Jessup, Folkestone. These are towns that, may have 2 or 3 traffic lights at best, and maybe a McDonald's and a couple of stop signs, but they're Georgians. And the interesting thing about Georgia is you still have the vestiges of the old South, where Black people going back 100 years, 200 years, stayed in these rural communities. And obviously we're during the slavery period. And since then, some of them still stay in those general areas in the rural parts of the state, very small towns and relatively less populated counties, but they're Georgians and they need to be touched. And so I've actually, as a candidate and as a Georgian, as a person, I try to do a mixture of the metropolitan Atlanta type campaigning, but also going to the rural communities and hearing the stories. Because when you talk with folks in Atlanta, concerns may be about economic development, gentrification, education, public school versus private school, other health issues, et cetera. But in the rural communities, I tell you, Norman Carter, there's some other issues. We want something in our towns. We want jobs in our towns. We don't want to have to go 40 miles to a hospital or go 60 miles to a Walmart. And so the rural Georgia is really almost a few years behind metropolitan Atlanta in terms of development. And so, but these people are very important, and I believe in listening and trying to come up with a way to respond to their needs.
One thing I'd like to bring up, since we're talking about rural counties for a minute or two, is Lincoln County, Georgia.
Yes.
Where the current Secretary of State was questioned about that recently, because this is a county with approximately maybe 9,000 people, and there's a proposal to close all but one of the polling places in this county. And the people in this county are pretty well spread out.
Yes.
How do we combat that? Because this is another step in voter suppression. Can be looked at that.
It is. For when I was chairman of Fulton County, a population of 1 million people, we actually had 350 precincts. And so because of the density of the population, you can actually have precincts that were probably 2 miles apart from each other. But because you had 30,000, 40,000 people in these areas, you had an opportunity to have a higher ratio of precincts to, or lower ratio of precincts to the population. Unfortunately, in Lincoln County, as you pointed out, in the eastern part of our state, even though it's a smaller population, 9,000, to go from one end of the county to another, or to even go to a centralized one location, may be, a 20, 30 mile drive, or maybe even longer. It's no big deal, perhaps, if you got 2 or 3 cars in your garage. Mm-hmm. No big deal if you got money in your pocket. But what if you don't have access to transportation? And so your only logical recourse is to maybe even do absentee ballot voting. But if that's not your preferred option, you got to get Uncle Charlie or granddaughter Ann to take you to that one precinct. Whereas under the former layout, it was with more in that county, it was probably closer to where you live. And so these tactics are just one of many that are being used to kind of nip away, to make it difficult for some. And that some adds up in many communities to many. And so I want your listening audience to know this is a numbers game. You win an election by getting 50% of the vote plus one person. And so when you start nipping away with a person here, a person there, or some people here, some people there, it adds up over time. And before you know it, instead of you having the majority, you have the minority and you don't win.
There's one point I'd like to make, and perhaps you can, because you have traveled or you will be traveling across Georgia, and this is a question that I posed to anyone throughout the country, is that when we talk about disparity in elections, we have a tendency to focus simply on minorities. But there are a significant number of non-Blacks who live in these rural communities who are disenfranchised by some of these voting practices. Do you find that to be true in your travels?
Yes, I mean, I think the intent of many of the laws that are being passed are designed to make it more difficult for people of color to vote because of the browning of America, the browning of the state of Georgia, the browning of Texas, et cetera. But these laws that are being developed and these practices that are being adopted sometimes in effect also affect seniors. Seniors are Black, brown, white. The disabled are Black, brown, and white. And it does have an impact on rural communities. So even though the intent may be towards a particular group, the effect actually can be on a much larger group than the original intent. And that's, to me, the irony of it. My attitude is to make voting accessible to everybody. Let the chips fall where they may. Make it accessible. I'm a Democrat, but I think Republicans should have just as much of access to voting as Democrats. I'm African American. I think whites and other races should have just as much access to voting as I and my brothers and sisters. So voting should be made easier as opposed to being made more difficult.
In that same vein, there is a big controversy now because you mentioned mail-in ballots, but there's a controversy about voter identification laws now, or as part of that's coming in to these new restrictive voting requirements. What is your view on that, Doctor?
Yeah, I think that the bigger issue is not so much the ID laws, because if a person did not have ID laws or what we call exact match, they could become counted as what's called a provisional ballot, and then they can be verified later on. But to me, the larger issue is voter confusion. And so there's a lot of conversation in the media, conversation within communities about changing of the voter laws. And you and I are probably well read and listen to news and read the newspaper, whatever, but everybody doesn't do that. And so when they just hear snippets of information, it only adds to confusion and perhaps even apathy, and perhaps people concluding that what's the point of voting? And so that, to me, that's the real challenge. It's not so much the specifics of what's happening, which in themselves are bad, but it's just so many things that are being said about the voting process and the changes. It adds to confusion and a lot of misunderstanding.
And I think you touch on a big point here about voter apathy, because the confusion is generating that. And I will speak to specifically here the city of South Fulton in Georgia, which their last mayoral election, they had maybe 30% or less turnout for voting. And in this area, particularly metropolitan Atlanta, where being known as the birthplace or the cradle of the civil rights struggle of the United States, that voter apathy would seem to be anathema, as opposed to something that we actively have to campaign against now, especially at a time when the importance of the office that you're particularly running for, Secretary of State, is one of the most important offices for guaranteeing the access to voting and the right to votes for every citizen of Georgia.
Yeah. Voter apathy, voter non-participation, those are all concerns. You're right. The city of South Fulton, population of about 100,000 people, very few people voted in the recent mayoral elections, the runoff especially. And to a certain degree, even in Atlanta, largest city, of course, did not have as many people voting in that election as it should be. And so to me, that's the real danger, is getting people to be apathetic. And unfortunately, I think historically Black people, and we certainly have a past, and you certainly described it in your intro, there have been tactics, there have been attempts to try to discourage Black people, whether it's intimidation or the various tests that were used to determine your eligibility to voting, the pencil test, the grandfather clause, the counting of jelly beans in the jar. All of those tactics occurred in the South, and they were all designed to discourage, frustrate people. And I think, to me, there's some vestiges of that now. And so, to me, I do believe that Black people, because of historical reasons, could be discouraged, compared to the larger population. And so I think that all of these can be leading towards voter suppression is also suppressing of the behavior and the attitude. It's not just a physical thing, it's also a mental and psychological thing as well.
One of the advantages, and Georgia has so many few advantages, of the position that you're a candidate for, Secretary of State, is that it is separate from the position of governor, and it's an elected position,
right,
where in other states that is not true. So we're hoping for a nice transfer and communication between the office of Secretary of State and the office of governor. But we just had an election where it was felt that Georgia was fertile ground for the type of corruption this country has never, ever seen before. And some of the vestiges of that are still with us right now today in government, and they will be there should you be successful in your campaign. So how would you deal with that, sir?
Yeah, the vestiges are there, and the vestiges are also codified in some respects in terms of law. So let's go back to the Lincoln County example that you cited. So each county in Georgia, I'm not sure how it is in other places around the country, but each county in Georgia has a local election board. And this board is usually a representative from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And then you have a so-called, not neutral, but a third or fifth person who chairs the board. And some of these boards are Republican leaning or Democratic leaning. And so the Republican leaning board can make a decision, like it did in Lincoln County, to consolidate and just have one voting precinct. But in addition to that, the state of Georgia, if they feel that the local board is not doing its job and the local Department of Elections in a specific county is not doing its job, it can it can call on a review and replace that board with one person who can make unilateral or sole decisions about voting in a particular county. And in Georgia, the state election board that oversees the elections, the Secretary of State's office is a part of this. Of this county, this state has 10 million, 11 million people. That state election board does not have a Black person on it.
Wow.
That state election board can call on the removal or process to remove a local board and choose anybody that they want to oversee the elections of that county elections process. That's codified in law now. And so that is the biggest danger to me, is that you can actually legally do some things that are unjust by removing and targeting certain counties if the state does not feel that the county is doing what it should be doing.
Now, one of the county that you're most familiar with, Fulton County, is under threat of this very action right now. Isn't that true?
It is. It is. And so the law went into effect. The law was passed in 2021 by the state legislature. It went into effect January the 1st. And my understanding is there is a review process of Fulton County's elections process by this review board that's authorized by the state elections board. I know I'm saying a lot of information with your listening audience, but this Fulton County is under review, and it could be taken over, and one single person can oversee the elections process in Fulton County.
The one reason why I mentioned Fulton County is because the former president of the United States specifically mentioned Fulton County and wanted an investigation of Fulton County votes. And this is unprecedented behavior. And this is why, Dr. Eaves, that I wanted to have you on this interview, because if integrity was ever an important part of this fabric of American government that we've grown to embrace, now is more important time. Is more of an important time than ever. And I just like you to comment about your record of integrity, not only as an elected official and as a citizen, sir.
Well, thank you for that. Let me first address, if you don't mind, the Fulton County thing. All right. And I'm going to say this as directly as I can. Fulton County has been almost racial code word of that Black-run county. And I say that because I was chairman of Fulton County for 11 years. Find votes in Fulton County because of a racial belief that that county was a dysfunctionally run county because of Black leadership. They didn't say go to Gwinnett County. They didn't say go to Cobb County. They didn't say go, they said Fulton County. Now, I know you've spent some time in the Northeast, and that this may or may not be a fair comment, but you know, they used to point at Newark as a place that wasn't run well. And it was an attack on the Black leadership in Newark. And so the same thing applies to Fulton County. Now, when I was chairman of Fulton County, we did a lot to change its image. We did a lot of things in a bipartisan way. We talked about unity and consensus building. And a lot of those perceptions of a dysfunctional county government were dispelled because I sort of govern in a very even styled way. I embraced the northern part of the county that was mostly white, and I embraced the southern part of the county that was mostly African American, and we just kind of developed and changed the image. And so I think that leads to your comment, your compliment about integrity. We certainly ran a pretty good ship for 11 years, and to a certain degree, it's still run in a very good way, where we had efficiency, transparency, and no scandals occurred when I was chairman of Fulton County in terms of corruption or any type of issues that sometimes is tagged towards government, especially, you know, sometimes when it's Black run, and it's nothing substantive about that. It's just sort of this racial thing that sometimes people try to tag Black government, Black-led government as being corrupt, and that's not true.
Yeah, that also happened in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And someone's trying to create that situation in the city of South Fulton, but that's for another day. Could you explain to the public the additional, we've talked a lot about voting rights and voting, but additional duties as Secretary of State that you would have?
Let me tell you, that's when I get really excited, because people just think about voting and elections, but this is a big job. There are really four major divisions of the Secretary of State's office. There's the elections division, oversees the elections process in the state, works with the state elections board, and then there's voting. 8 million people in Georgia are registered to vote. But there are three other big parts. One of them is called the corporations division. So every business in Georgia that wants to be a recognized legal business entity, they must register with the Secretary of State's office in order to be able to legally operate in the state. And the Secretary of State's office can go after, it has investigatory powers to go after so-called businesses that are illegal, that are scammers, that are con artists. And so there's the corporations division, and there are 1.1 million small businesses in Georgia. We have one of the highest number of small businesses than the country. I came across some stat that there are actually almost as many Black businesses in Georgia as there are in New York State, which is pretty amazing.
Wow.
It is phenomenal. It's something really interesting about the entrepreneur spirit of Black business owners in Georgia. A lot of it's driven by people in Atlanta. So you have the corporations division. And then you have what's called the oversight of licensing boards, architects and dentists and doctors and construction people and pharmacists and notary publics, et cetera. These individuals have licensing requirements, certification requirements to be an occupational professional in the state of Georgia, to do pharmacy, to practice medicine, to practice dentistry. Well, the licensing boards of each of these entities, the Secretary of State's office convenes the meetings of these boards to make sure that people are in compliance with their occupation or their profession. And if somebody is not compliant, their board can go after them or make them, I forgot the term, but make them no longer qualified to practice in the state of Georgia. And then the fourth area is the securities division. And the securities division regulates a lot of the financial advising, the individuals like who consult with you and I, who are you and I in terms of your financial planning, your financial retirement accounts, the bank, the private equity space. And so if there's any sort of improprieties that occur in the financial securities arena, again, the Secretary of State has investigatory ability to go after these individuals. So seniors like who are being scammed, Secretary of State's office tries to protect those people. So it's a really big office. It's actually 3 offices in Georgia, Macon, Tifton, and Atlanta. A multi-million-dollar budget, has tremendous oversight and impact on the lives of people in Georgia.
That being said, with the increased the aging of America, I would think that office would also be important in areas such as nursing homes and licensing, and even the licensings of daycare facilities and whatnot. Could you comment a little bit about that? Or
yeah, and a little bit more morbid is funeral homes, and so funeral homes have to be compliant They have to operate in accordance to certain professional standards. Cemeteries are supposed to be maintained according to certain professional standards, cosmetic and substantive. So the Secretary of State's office oversees all of that. And if anybody is non-compliant, or if there are reports, or I can't even, I'm losing words here, but if there are any sort of reports of bad practices or whatever, non-compliance, the Secretary of State's office oversees, and again, I've said this several times before, has an investigator, can investigate. And if something is not being done right, can consult with the Attorney General's office and do some prosecution of these individuals.
I just had a thought. I wonder how many people who are considering your candidacy ever consider these other areas of great importance to the citizens that are never thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a competitive, crowded field. I certainly feel that I have the background, the experience, but I'm discovering that folks don't take the time out to learn. And I've done that. I don't know everything there is to know, but I know a lot. And it's a big office, and I speak to it when I go out on the campaign trail and talk to them. The emotional issue is voting. Certainly everybody's emotional about that. It's in the news often. It certainly is something happening in Georgia and across the nation in terms of voter suppression. But there are other meat and potato issues that the Secretary of State's office oversees and is involved in that impacts your everyday life. And very few of the other candidates speak to this wider range of the duties of the Secretary of State's office.
Fantastic. What do you think separates you most from the other candidates who are running?
Yeah, I think I have a broad platform. And let me go back to the corporations division. And I'm going to preface all of this by saying diversity is our strength. The increased diversity in the state of Georgia and in the nation, in my opinion, is the strength of our country and the strength of Georgia. And I'm proud of the fact that I'm a Georgian now by residency, and we are a very diverse state. So one of the areas that I am very concerned about is in the area of Black and brown business owners being able to access procurement opportunities. So millions and billions of dollars flow through government for sidewalks to be paved, for bridges to be built, for streets to be cleaned, for computers to be purchased, for services to be provided. And so government hires or contracts with companies to provide many of these services. And when it comes to the procurement or the awarding of contracts for Black and brown business owners to pave streets, build bridges, to do certain things, with all of this 49% presence in the state, 32% Black population in the state, the number of Black and brown people who get the contracts are in the single low digits or the low single digits, and that's unacceptable. And so, Norman, what I've been talking about is we need to recognize and embrace our diversity from an economic standpoint. We need to be equitable, come up with policies to make sure that the playing field is level. We need to do a better job to outreach to Black and brown business owners and encourage them to procure contracts, and they must be included. So I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of the economic benefits of the state of Georgia. Many people talk about economic injustice, and economic injustice is talked about how John Doe may not get a good job and is underpaid compared to somebody else. Well, economic injustice also occurs on a governmental procurement process, and I'm going to address that as the next Secretary of State of Georgia.
Well, thank you for that. One thing that I noticed in your both in your campaigning and in your uh, presentation is even though we're deeply concerned about the plight of minority communities uh, throughout the state of Georgia and throughout this country, you seem to be making a concerted effort. You continually mention diversity in your comments, and that implies inclusivity for all people. So how are you able to clearly get that out, that one message out? Because as you know, we have, to be honest with it, we have communities, or possible communities in Georgia that the concept of voting for an African American is totally alien to them. But there is some hope after the election, or the former gubernatorial election, where Stacey Abrams almost won the state. So do you find inspiration from that,
I
or
do,
lessons from that?
I do, but I get inspiration from many of our foreparents who led the way, whether it's Maynard Jackson, the first Black mayor of Atlanta, Doug Wilder, first Black governor in Virginia, Harold Washington, the first Black mayor in Chicago, Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president 1968 or 1972, one of the 2 years. I get inspiration, and these people were trailblazers, and so, and I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna say this in a very respectful way. I just think that America needs to acknowledge that Black people can be great leaders, and leadership is not owned by any particular race, but Black people are certainly qualified and can be great leaders. And we just have to, as a society, if you're not Black, get used to a Black person providing leadership. You know, we grew up in an era where we saw leadership, for the most part, only looking a certain way, whether it's a certain race or a certain gender. Well, leaders can be all types. And I think that in 2022 and beyond, we just got to get used to the fact that Black people, with all that we have to deal with, we can be great leaders, and not only great leaders, but we can be very fair. Yeah, we may address issues of inequity. We want to make sure that the playing field is equal for all people, especially Black people who have been deprived and denied. But we are fair. We're very fair. And people just got to get used to it. They will have to get used to it. And so I'm putting forth my candidacy. There's some people who are going to vote for me because of my background. There's some people who won't vote for me because I'm a Black man. Yeah, I'm light skinned, but I'm still a Black man. But it's unfortunate, but there's some people like that. But when I'm elected, I'm going to be for all Georgians.
Do you feel the additional pressure that Georgia, the focus on this Georgia election, is probably being watched by the entire country because of the recent events of 2020? Do you realize that your success as a candidate for Secretary of State will probably keep you perpetually under the American microscope?
Yeah, you know what? Yes, absolutely. And I tell people right now that because when I go out and about and I campaign, I was in Clayton County this Saturday, and a lot of people didn't even know the race was coming up in May. But I tell people, even though you don't know about the race right now, you will know about this race at some point between now and November the 8th, which is when the general election is going to occur. The eyes of the nation, you're right, the eyes of the nation will be on Georgia. Yes, there can be other states that are having their own races, but Georgia is really unique in terms of some of the things you cited earlier in the interview about Trump, et cetera, but it's unique in terms of the number of Black people who are going to potentially be on the ballot for election of statewide offices. That's going to be very different. Right now, we can point to, a state here and a state there that has one person running for office statewide, but Georgia may have several who are running for a statewide office at the same time. And it's because of the presence of African Americans or Black people who are in this state who have a high percentage of the voting bloc. And it can happen. So there are a variety of reasons why the eyes of the nation will be on Georgia, and reasons also that they'd be on the race that I'm in.
Well, Dr. Eaves, we started off, and I happened to mention at the beginning about your campaigns containing both an educational factor, informational factor, as well as inspirational factor. Now, this program will be available on YouTube months, maybe years after today. So I want to give you you've had an opportunity to educate us. Would you like to inspire the electorate out there about this coming election for the office of Secretary of State of Georgia as we get to the closing portion of our program?
Yeah. So thank you for this. All right. Hopefully in the archive in the future, they're going to be talking about the first Black woman nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. And whoever that individual is, there will be a Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court, the first one ever. And the reason why we're going to have a Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court is because voters in Georgia came out in 2020 and elected Joe Biden as president. That was the first thing. And secondly, elected in a surprising way 2 Democratic senators because of the alignment of a Democratic president who made a campaign promise he was going to nominate the first Black woman to the Supreme Court, and the election of 2 Democratic senators who brought the total up to 50 Democrats. A simple majority plus the vice president voted can confirm the U.S. Supreme Court justice who will be a Black woman. So for anybody who says my vote doesn't count, particularly if you're a Black person and other people in Georgia, the votes of Georgians, especially Black and brown, Jewish, liberal whites, etc., LGBTQ community, voted Biden number 1, 2 U.S. senators number 2, Democrats. Because of Georgia, the next Supreme Court justice, who will be a Black woman, can point to Georgia and say that's why she was appointed and nominated and confirmed. And so the same is for my race. There will be a Black person as Secretary of State of Georgia, first time ever. And I'm 99.9% sure it's going to be me.
Okay. All right.
And
all
so
right.
I want your vote because I think that this is not only historic, but what I want to do as Secretary of State will be impactful for our state.
Dr. Eaves, I believe voter registration here in Georgia is up until 4/25, May 25th, April 25th, I'm sorry. And that the advanced or absentee voting ends May 2nd. Does that sound right?
It does. So generally speaking, 30 days outside of the election, registration stops. So the election for the primary is May the 24th. And so roughly 30 days prior to that is around April the 25th. And then application for absentee ballot is generally relatively early as well. So you have to apply for an absentee ballot. Make sure you complete the form correctly. Cross all the T's, dot all the I's, make sure all your information is correct. You send it in, then the state or the Department of Elections for your county will send you an absentee ballot. And then once you get the absentee ballot, you must submit it, I believe, by the day of the election. So there's some specific deadlines that people need to follow. If they don't follow those deadlines, their vote may not count.
One thing I'd like to mention, maybe you can comment on that, sir, is from the Brennan Center for Justice I read earlier about the fact that traditionally minority communities have fewer polling places and consequently longer lines. And this is one of the voter suppression tactics that's going on. Will you be able to, as Secretary of State, bring some relief to that situation and address the situation prior to coming elections?
Yeah, without question. I think that's a great question. Right now, there's a very inconsistent county by county way of determining, how many precincts there are and how many poll workers you hire. I believe that there's technology now. Technology right now can predict traffic flow, crowd flow in terms of you getting on an airplane and the airline predicting how many people will come based on usage. And the point is, there are models out there, mathematical models out there that can determine the best way to allocate resources, the peak times that people come in, and you can make some educated decisions based on data. And I think that we got the data, and we just have to have a different approach, and more of a data-driven approach, as opposed to shooting from the hip or just these historical practices that don't apply today. And so I will bring that fresh eye approach. In other words, let's assess how we're doing and make voting meet customer service standards.
Okay.
Customer service standards. We are government managing an elections process. We want the process to be a pleasant one for the customer. Your tax dollar pays for this. Let's make it a pleasant experience. And I don't think that elections are run that way. They don't run it as we are government trying to make the voting process an easy, painless experience. And so I will bring that approach. We're going to make this a customer-friendly experience. Evaluate us on how well we perform. We want a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5 or 4.5. We want, and I'm going to recognize those counties that have exemplary service. We're going to give you an award. I think that type of approach is the way we should go. Look at it as providing the voter as a customer the best experience possible and make voting painless and easy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eaves. I really appreciate you coming on this program and both educating us and inspiring us. Before I get into my closing remarks, it really has been informational, and I wish you the greatest success in your campaign for Secretary of State, sir.
Thank you so much, Norman. This was great. As always, this is the second time you've interviewed me, and you're just as good as Ed Bradley, man.
I think he was from Philadelphia too, but anyway.
All right, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And folks, before I close, I just want to, it's related to election, and I hope I'm not going to confuse too many of you. Elbridge Gerry was an American founding father, politician, and diplomat who served as the 5th Vice President of the United States. And there's a whole lot enraptured in this, but I think we need to worry about gerrymandering, because that is the next step in this process of voter suppression and making the powerless silent. And I think you need to do some research. We'll talk about that a little bit more in coming programs. But again, Dr. Eaves, thank you so very, very much for joining us, the WCEG Network. And we wish you the greatest success. And thank you, all you listeners.
And Norman, can I just say, if they want to check me out, go to my website at johneavesforgeorgia.com, and I'll be more than happy to provide information to you and contact if you want more information.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much.